Okay, welcome to part two of Unit 6. We're still talking about development here. Today we're going to be looking at a pretty short little section that's going to focus on infancy and childhood, but specifically the physical development. So, infancy and childhood, there's a ton of stuff going on. So, it's broken into three sections. The first of which is this one, which is physical development. The next one is going to be cognitive development, and the last one is social development. So, it's all going to be the same time period. But we're going to be looking at different factors basically that are going on and different changes that are happening. So, talking about physical development, the first big thing that we have to talk about is what is called maturation. So, maturation is the biological growth process that enables orderly changes in behavior relatively uninfluenced by experience. So, in general, maturation is going to be relatively similar for basically all of us. It's this general idea of aging, that our bodies will change over time due to these biological processes that are going on. And again, it's generally speaking not going to be super influenced by the experiences that go on in our life. Now, obviously, there's kind of extreme examples of this, but in general, regardless of what your parents do socially or what kind of household you live in or what school you go to or any of those other kind of things, eventually you're going to hit puberty. Eventually you're going to, if you're a female, go through like menstruation, and like there's all these other kind of things that are going to go on that are just happening biologically. They're not necessarily going to be influenced by the things that are going on. Again, and now this is maybe why we start here because it's very important. So biological maturation, which is this nature side of things, if we want to talk nature versus nurture, is setting the basic course for development. As we look at developmental psychology, one thing you'll notice is that there's this kind of biological just maturation that's going to be going on, and this is going to basically kind of set what's going to happen in general. And then our experiences, what we do in our life and what happens to us, will kind of make slight adjustments to that. We'll kind of see where these come in a little bit later. But in general, like I said, if you take a baby, they are going to go through growth spurts. They are going to learn language at some point. They are going to eventually hit puberty. They are eventually going to hit adulthood, right? All those things will happen, but they're happening biologically, and it really doesn't matter too much what's going on environment-wise. But those environmental impacts will have a little bit different things later on, where it might cause kind of small course adjustments if we think of it as like a road we're driving on. So let's talk first about brain development. So during our prenatal development, our brain is actually kind of like I said, kind of going crazy. We talked about blooming before, where our brain is forming nerve cells at a rate of nearly 250,000 per minute. So by the time we were born, we actually have almost all of the brain cells that we'll have for our entire life. Now, brain cells do die, and we do create new ones. But generally speaking, the ones that we have are the ones that we're going to start our life with, and they'll just kind of be like replaced as time goes on for different things. But we're not going to gain more, if that makes sense. Over time, we actually end up losing these cells as opposed to gaining them. So we're born with kind of the most brain cells that we'll ever have in our lifetime. There'll be different ones, but we'll never have as many. Now, after birth, because you might be asking, well, then why aren't infants incredibly intelligent or anything? But what's happening is there still needs to be a lot of wiring going on. So once we're born, our brain starts wiring itself. It's creating these different neural networks, and it's kind of enabling all of these other things that we're going to see, whether it be our physical motor abilities or our language abilities or our cognitive abilities that we'll talk about later. All of those are about the network that's being created as opposed to just having those cells there. So we have the cells, and then as we live, we start creating all these different networks. We also see a few other changes. So one of the really big ones is the frontal lobe grow very rapidly from ages 3 to 6. Again, we'll see that a little bit later when we talk about the cognitive pieces, where we'll get to kind of see where these different cognitive steps happen, where if you've ever talked to like a really young child, like a 3-year-old, you can talk to them and some of the stuff they say just doesn't make sense, right? Like it's just wrong. And what we actually see, and we'll see this later, is their brains just literally aren't wired the same way. They're not able to comprehend things the same way that you can as an adult, or even as, maybe a 10-year-old sometimes. So we'll kind of see that as well. And then the last part of our brain that's actually going to develop is our association areas. So if you remember back to biology, these association areas are kind of the most important when it comes to complex thought. So thinking, memory, language are all very much connected with association areas where we're kind of doing higher level things there. So it makes sense that those abilities come later on in life because those areas of our brains aren't fully developed at the beginning of life, right? It takes time for those to develop, and they'll be the last ones to kind of get there. So I do want to make a connection, though, between our motor development and some of this cognitive development that's going on, or at least the development of the brain that's going on. So this motor sequence, we talked before about the 6 motor milestones. This motor development actually happens in this sequence, and it's universal, and it's actually due to the development of the nervous system. So you might think that the reason babies can't move around is because of their muscles, but it's actually because of their nervous system. Basically, their nervous system is not strong enough to allow them to do all the things that they'll eventually be able to do. So as they grow, as they mature, basically their nervous system creates this road to what they're going to be able to do. Right, it's that maturation that's creating the readiness for them to do these different things like walking, or obviously even like controlling your bladder, right? Which is why babies you have to wear a diaper and you have to clean them and stuff like that. But eventually you get to the point where you're able to, if you have to go to the bathroom, you can wait and you can hold it. You can control when that happens. So all of those things actually happen based on this biological kind of time frame. Because of these neural systems, not because our muscles aren't able to necessarily do it, but the nervous system isn't able to, tell the body to do it or tell it to do these different things at that point. Now, and I guess one thing that's, this will let's go to the last piece, I guess. So that doesn't mean, though, that there aren't any impacts from nurture or from our environment. So we do know that, like, if you took a baby and you exercise them, so what that basically means is if you take their limbs and you move their arms and you move their legs as if they're walking, it'll actually speed up, accelerate the process of learning to walk. Now, again, this isn't like if I sit there with my baby and I work their little legs that they're going to start walking at 4 months old. It's just going to probably move it up a little quicker. It's not going to necessarily make this giant difference. And again, all of these things, though, are happening with the maturation of the baby, with the maturation of their nervous system. This is why, like I said, when you're doing potty training, you can't potty train a 4-month-old. You can't. It's literally impossible. Because, again, their body just literally isn't able to do it. Same thing with walking. Same thing with, even standing. They just physically can't do that. So there's kind of a little bit of both. Again, that if it's a really good example of how the nature, our genetics and our biology set this general where that we're going, and then the nurture can make little impacts, slow something down, speed something up a little bit, but overall we're still basically going pretty similar pace. So the last piece that we'll talk a little bit about is memory as it's connected to our brains. So one thing that is kind of an interesting thing to think about and talk about is what's called infantile amnesia. Basically, this is the fact that we basically can't remember almost anything from the age of before 4, right? From 4 or earlier. So if you're trying to, even right now, if you think back and you try and think of a memory of being a baby, it's very unlikely that you can remember one. And as we talked about with memory before, if you do remember one, it's also very likely that it's actually one that you've created, not a real memory. So one of the things you might wonder is, why is that, right? Our brains obviously function. Babies can learn. They can learn to recognize people and objects. They can create associations between different things. They can tell different people apart, right? You probably know, a baby can tell the difference between their mom and another lady, right? So they can do these things. Why don't I remember anything? And what actually is happening is that because of this rewiring that's going on, basically we lose a bunch of these memories that we create. Now, they're still kind of there in a way, but they're not necessarily conscious. So one thing that we can see is that traces of what are called like a forgotten childhood language can be seen in someone who's 40 years old. So what a forgotten childhood language would be is, let's say, maybe you are born in, I'm just going to say like Italy, for example, and so you're around people that speak Italian for when you're a very, very young child. So your first kind of languages are Italian. Maybe you can even speak Italian a little bit when you're very young. But then your parents pick up and they move to the U.S. And you spend, the majority of your childhood, maybe when you're like 2 years old or something, or maybe even 3 years old, they come to the U.S. and from there you speak English and you actually don't remember any of the Italian you could speak originally. That's kind of what a forgotten language would be. But what they're saying is that even though maybe you don't understand or speak it all the way, there might be little traces of it in there. So when we talked about language, we talked about different things like phonemes and morphemes and different ways of understanding different sounds or being able to make different sounds. Those could maybe be these traces that we'll see later on in life. So even though there aren't conscious memories, there are still memories and associations and information that is being stored by these young children. So that's actually going to wrap up our first part, which is the physical development of, again, infants through early childhood. Again, we'll continue this on and look at the cognitive side and the social side in our next videos.